The British general knew the battle was over before the shooting stopped. Not because his lines had broken, that had already happened, but because the tempo of the war around him had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Messages stopped arriving. Orders stopped making sense. Units that were supposed to exist no longer answered. And somewhere beyond the smoke and dust, a German commander was already thinking about the next battle as if this one had ended hours ago. When the white flag finally went up over Tobruk in June 1942, it did not mark the end of a fight. It marked the realization that the fight had ended long before anyone admitted it. And the man who forced that realization, Erwin Rommel, was already on his way to meet the British general who had waited too long to surrender. What Rommel said in that meeting would not just define the fall of Tobruk. It would define the difference between two ways of understanding war. By the summer of 1942, North Africa had become a battlefield unlike any other in the Second World War. There were no cities to hold, no forests to hide in, no rivers to anchor defensive lines. There was only distance, fuel, and time. Armies did not fight for ground. They fought for momentum. Rommel understood this better than anyone else on either side. While other commanders thought in terms of fronts and positions, Rommel thought in terms of movement. He treated the desert like an ocean, his armored divisions like ships, constantly probing, circling, and striking where the enemy was weakest. He ignored the traditional caution that governed most German operations and replaced it with speed so aggressive that even his own superiors struggled to follow it. The British 8th Army, by contrast, was fighting two wars at once. One against Rommel and one against its own structure. Orders came from Cairo, were interpreted in the field, and often arrived too late to matter. Command changes were frequent. Coordination was inconsistent. And while individual British and Commonwealth units fought with determination, the larger system they operated within struggled to match the pace that Rommel imposed on the battlefield. Tobruk sat at the center of this conflict. A fortified port city on the Libyan coast, it had resisted German assault the previous year and become a symbol of British endurance. It was supposed to hold again. It was supposed to anchor the line. Rommel had no intention of allowing that. Before we look at the moment the gates of the fortress finally opened, if you value these deep dives into the psychological turning points of history, consider subscribing to History Beyond Battle. We explore the untold stories and the human decisions that shape the world's greatest conflicts. By subscribing, you help us continue to bring these moments of historical clarity to life. The defense of Tobruk in 1942 fell to Major General Hendrik Klopper of the South African Army. Klopper was not an incompetent officer. He was disciplined, methodical, and loyal to his orders. But he had inherited a situation that was already unraveling. The German assault did not come as a slow tightening of the perimeter. It came as a rupture. Rommel identified a weak point in the defensive line and struck it with overwhelming force. Tanks, artillery, and air power coordinated with a precision that the defenders could not match. Within hours, what had been a fortified system became a series of isolated pockets. Communications broke down almost immediately. Units that were supposed to support each other lost contact. Supply routes were cut. Ammunition and water, both critical in the desert, became uncertain. Reports reached Klopper that German armor was already inside the perimeter, moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Still, he held his position, because that was what he had been ordered to do. As the day progressed, the situation moved from difficult to impossible. German units bypassed strong points instead of engaging them, leaving them isolated and irrelevant. British formations that attempted to regroup found themselves attacked from directions they did not expect. The defensive plan assumed a kind of battle that was no longer happening. By the afternoon, Tobruk was no longer a fortress, it was a collapsing system. Klopper received conflicting reports. Some suggested resistance was still possible. Others made it clear that the Germans were already deep inside the defensive network. The fog of war, combined with the speed of Rommel's advance, created a situation where clarity itself became a casualty. And in that environment, Klopper made the decision that many commanders in his position make. He waited. He waited for confirmation. He waited for a clearer picture. He waited for the moment when surrender would be unquestionably justified. That moment came too late. When the surrender was finally initiated, it happened quickly. White flags appeared across the remaining positions. Firing stopped in uneven bursts. German units moved forward cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as it became clear that organized resistance had ended. Rommel chose to accept the surrender personally. He arrived not with ceremony, but with urgency. Dust-covered, moving at the same pace he had maintained throughout the battle, he entered what remained of the British command area as if it was simply another waypoint. The meeting took place in the open, under the same sun that had watched the battle unfold. Around them were the physical results of the previous hours: burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, men too exhausted to react to anything beyond immediate orders. Klopper approached with his staff. He carried himself with the composure expected of a senior officer, but the context of that composure had changed. He was no longer negotiating from a position of resistance. He was formalizing a defeat. Klopper began to speak about terms. He spoke about the treatment of prisoners. He spoke about the condition of the wounded. He spoke about the expectation of honorable conduct between professional armies. Rommel listened briefly, then he interrupted. He told Klopper that there were no terms to discuss, that the situation had already been decided. Not in that moment, but hours earlier. He said that what Klopper was describing as a negotiation was, in reality, a confirmation. Klopper responded that he had done his duty, that he had held his position as long as possible, that surrender had only been considered when further resistance would serve no purpose. It was a statement rooted in the traditional understanding of command. Hold until you cannot hold. Fight until you cannot fight. Rommel rejected that framework completely. He told Klopper that the purpose had already been lost long before the surrender was offered, that a commander's responsibility was not to hold until collapse, but to recognize when collapse had already begun. He said that waiting for the last possible moment was not discipline, it was delay. Then he delivered the line that officers on both sides would remember long after the war ended. He said, "You waited until the situation was hopeless. I made it hopeless." And then, after a pause, just long enough to ensure the meaning was clear, he added, "That is the difference." The effect of the statement was immediate. This was not an insult in the conventional sense. It was something more precise. Rommel was not attacking Klopper personally. He was redefining the entire sequence of events in a way that removed any sense of agency from the British decision to surrender. In Rommel's version of the battle, the outcome had been determined by action, not endurance, by speed, not resilience, by decisions made early, not decisions made at the end. Klopper did not respond immediately. There was nothing to respond with that would change the reality of the situation. The conversation ended not with agreement, but with acceptance. Rommel did not linger. Within hours, the machinery of surrender was in motion. Tens of thousands of prisoners were processed. Supplies were catalogued. The port, intact enough to be useful, was immediately integrated into German logistics. And Rommel moved on. Because for him, Tobruk was not a conclusion, it was a transition point. The road to Egypt was open, and every hour spent looking backward was an hour lost moving forward. This was the operational reality that defined his command. Battles were not endpoints, they were steps. The fall of Tobruk sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure. It was not just a defeat, it was a collapse that had happened faster than expected and with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. In London, the reaction was immediate and severe. The loss was described as a disaster. questions were asked about leadership, preparation, and the ability of the British command system to adapt to the kind of warfare Rommel was conducting. Klopper spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. His decisions at Tobruk would be examined, debated, and placed within the larger context of a campaign that exposed systemic weaknesses as much as individual ones. Rommel, for his part, was promoted to Field Marshal shortly after the victory. The promotion recognized not just the capture of Tobruk, but the method by which it had been achieved. Speed, clarity, and a refusal to operate within expectations that no longer matched reality. Years later, officers who studied the North African campaign would return to that exchange between Rommel and Klopper as a way of understanding something larger than the battle itself. They would say that Rommel's advantage was not just tactical, it was conceptual. He did not see war the way his opponents did, where others saw phases. He saw opportunities. Where others saw positions, he saw movement. Where others waited for certainty, he acted on probability. What he said to the British general was not improvised. It was a concise expression of how he approached every decision he made. He believed that by the time a situation becomes obviously hopeless, the outcome has already been decided by someone else, and he intended to be that someone. That was the difference. And in the desert in 1942, it was enough to decide the fate of an entire army before that army fully understood what was happening to it. Follow us for more stories from the front lines of history.